Film is a brilliant combination of written word, sound, music, and of course, pictures. So this week we're looking at the ways that we can tell a story visually rather than always relying on dialogue. Hello, my name is Simon Cade and this is DSLRguide. So a big problem with a lot of filmmakers when they first start out is that they spend a lot of time in their films with shots that look like this. If I asked you to explain what was going on in that film based on just that one frame, it would be guesswork. So the thing is that films like this often will use a voiceover to tell the story, or they might have characters who kind of awkwardly explain what's going on to each other so that the audience can also understand. And it's not that there's anything wrong with having dialogue scenes or that having a narrator is inherently bad, it's just that we need to look for opportunities to tell the story visually because we can get a lot more information in the same amount of time and present it in a more interesting way, I think. So we'll start with some really simple examples. Let's say that our character has just found out that their roommate has betrayed them, so they're very angry. Now we could just have some dialogue of the character saying, "I'm really angry, I can't believe you did that," or we could have them smash something or knock over a table. In the same situation, they could say absolutely nothing, but just slowly walk out of the room and grab a bag and start putting clothes into it, and they pack their bags and just leave. That could be a really powerful way to show that they are angry or that they feel betrayed without them saying a single word. And both of these are examples of ways that we can get across a lot of emotion without using dialogue. And I think it's often a more powerful way to do it because we're letting the audience think and letting the audience make the connection between those actions and emotions rather than just kind of really directly telling the audience what to think. But visual storytelling isn't just about emotions. We can also get across a lot of information about the plot by just using visual ideas. So let's say that we've got a character in a film which is all about survival, he's trying to survive in the wilderness, and then this happens. Now this is just one static image, but if we look at it, there's quite a lot of plot information there, even though it's very simple. So we've got a person who is happily relaxing, but he's unaware that behind him, his boat is no longer moored and it's drifting away. So if I showed someone just that one frame, they could probably write a whole paragraph about what they think is going on, because there's that old saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, that's true if you use it in a clever way. So this next one is really obvious, just to kind of really show exactly what I'm talking about. We've got someone who is poisoning the food of someone else. We know through the props that it's poison, and if we compare that to our old over-the-shoulder shot from before, you can definitely see which one tells more of a story. The audience starts to wonder, who is she and why is she killing them? And who are these people anyway? What is her motive? I think a good way to look at this is to look at spy films that you might have seen. It's really easy to film someone who's breaking into a building. You can have lots of really visual ideas of them climbing over fences, avoiding guards, and all that kind of thing. But if you want to have someone hack into a building or hack into a computer, then that is kind of a similar sort of thing, but actually is the complete opposite of your traditional visual way to tell a story. Because there's nothing that exciting about watching someone type for an hour and a half. So what you find in movies is that people often have these kind of visual interpretations of what it's like to be inside the computer, and they have ones and zeros all around and these like paths of light, because that's their way of trying to make something visual that really isn't visual. So I think it's definitely worth thinking about your subject matter and picking things that work visually, or trying to find some kind of way to interpret it that's a bit better than these silly ones and zeros computer animation things. So we know that we can pack a lot of emotion and information about the story into each frame, but how do we actually apply this to our own films? I think a really good way to do this is to look at a film that you really enjoy and see how they've interpreted things into visual ideas. So for example, one of my favourite films is Double Indemnity. I think there's a really good scene where they show the relationship between three characters purely by the way that they are placed in the scene. So for a bit of background, we've got Walter, who's an insurance salesman, and Phyllis, who is his client. They're working together to pull off an insurance scam, trying to avoid being caught by Walter's boss, who's called Keys. Now in the scene, Phyllis is quite literally hiding behind a door, and if Keys realises that she's with Walter, then it's game over for both of them. Through just the physical placement of the characters in the scene, it creates a lot of tension, and it also gives the audience the idea that Walter and Phyllis are very close to being caught, which is definitely a good kind of theme overall for the film. Now obviously I can't do it justice by just explaining what's happening with words, so on the blog post I'll link to a clip which actually has this exact scene, so you can watch it there and it'll make a lot more sense, trust me. So next up is framing and lighting. Probably the part of visual storytelling that gets talked about most, even though it's definitely not the most important. So in a nutshell, we can position the camera to choose exactly what we want the audience to see, and we can also affect the mood of the scene by the angle of the character and the quality of the light around them. Now I've already done videos about each of these topics in depth, which is what you've been seeing clips from. So again, I'll put them on the blog post so we don't have to talk about it too much here and repeat ourselves. Now the things that don't get talked about enough are probably production design, costume, and location. So these are some really good little details that can add up to really saying a lot about our character and about our film. So for example, obviously a character who dresses in really bright colours is going to be perceived very differently to someone who always dresses in dark, unsaturated colours. And the same goes for locations. If someone lives in somewhere that looks very modern, then that's going to say something very different than someone who lives in somewhere that's a bit more like a cottage and old-fashioned, or even just like the colours of things around them. For instance, in The Last Seduction, they used green paint on the walls to suggest that lust for money and that overall kind of greed. I think it generally goes for all parts of the production. You know, do your characters spend most of their time at home, or do they spend a lot of time in these really musky bars or really nice fancy restaurants? All of these details can help you to tell your story visually if you carefully consider them and think about what would be best for your characters and best for your film. And lastly, we're going to look at symbolism. Now this is when something which is usually an object has a deeper meaning for a character or for the film. So for example, if a character gives someone else a red rose, then without knowing anything else, we can probably guess that there's some kind of romance between those two people. Or if someone keeps looking at a picture of someone else, then we can kind of infer that maybe they miss them, or maybe they wish things could be like they were in the good old days. So often in films, characters will have a little trinket or something that means a lot to them, and then we see that as that trinket gets broken or lost, or maybe the character decides they don't need it anymore, that can be a really interesting way for us to show a character development when something that was really important to them before then changes a little bit as the film goes on. It's a really good way to communicate with the audience on a more subconscious level. So for instance, in 2001 A Space Odyssey, which is a film full of symbols that I definitely don't entirely understand, but we keep seeing this giant monolith throughout the film. After watching the film for the first time, I definitely didn't understand everything, but then I read some articles about it and I heard some other people's really interesting interpretations. I think that is what's so interesting about this idea of visual filmmaking, is that we can litter our films with little visual ideas about emotion and about the plot, but also about the deeper meaning, and it creates this really nice kind of layered effect where the audience can go away and think about the film and then understand it more and have a lot more of an interesting experience overall. So hopefully we've all learned something about the level of detail that goes into making a film, and we've got some ideas for making our own films and also analysing other films so that we can see how they use visual storytelling in a really good way. Because I think the best films, and I'm not the first person to say this, but the best films show rather than telling. So that's pretty much it for this week. As usual, there's a lot more information on the blog post, but that's it for this week and I'll see you next time.